We are so thrilled and honored to have won the Silver Award at the 5th Annual Anthem Awards in the Human and Civil Rights Podcast category. By amplifying the voices that spark global change, the Anthem Awards are defining a new benchmark for impactful work that inspires others to take action in their communities. And for Future Hindsight to be recognized means so much to us. Thank you to Anthem Awards, and thank you, our dedicated listeners. If storytelling is the foundation of our democracy, how do we best tell that story of liberation and justice for all? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. What if the stories we tell ourselves about society, about who deserves what, who belongs, and what's possible, are the very forces that shape our reality? Today, we're joined by Shanelle Matthews, a leading voice in narrative power and social movement communications. As co-editor of Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements, founder of the Radical Communicators Network, and former communications director for the Movement for Black Lives, Shanelle has spent her career understanding how the stories that dominate our culture serve power, and how we can rewrite them to serve justice instead. And before we start, thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful. And if you want to support Future Hindsight, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's easy and free, and a great way to build your civic action toolkit every week. Head to youtube.com/Future Hindsight to subscribe after this episode. Welcome, Shanelle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mila.
So, the anthology of Liberation Stories is about narrative power. What exactly is narrative power? Explain it like I'm 5. How does it work?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because narrative power is all around us, but we don't think about it very often. So narrative power is about the ability to tell stories in a society, including how they're told and how they're interpreted. It's really about the ability to shape people's beliefs and worldviews through storytelling. And so I work in social movements, and there are so many different parts of social movements that you can be a part of. You can be an artist or a fundraiser or a legal expert or a policy advocate, but all of those roles require you to be able to tell a story. So, for example, if you're telling a story about a piece of legislation, about why it needs to be passed or repealed or amended, the goal there is to get people to act in a particular kind of way. And stories really function as the glue that holds our society together and what persuades people to make decisions about their lives in a democracy or in other places. And so narrative power is really about how we tell stories that govern our lives and how those shape our material conditions.
Right. Well, so I mentioned in the intro that the stories that dominate our culture serve power. What is the dominant ideological narrative of today that we live in, and that we widely accept as common sense?
It depends on what aspect of life you're talking about. For the economics, it's capitalism. But I think, as we saw with this big upset in New York, that there are people who are interested in other types of economic ideologies, like democratic socialism. If you're thinking about how we love one another, right? For many decades and even centuries in this country, it was really about centering heterosexual love and a specific type of romantic love. But we've seen in the last half a century that people have been advocating for different types of love, same-sex love, or even asexual experiences. And so the dominant ideologies in our society change over time, especially as movement workers and people who are thinking about how to build a bigger we and a bigger vision for how America exists, start to insert those new ideas and really start to tinker with how people think about how they should be living their lives.
It's interesting that you mentioned that it depends on who you are, where you are, and how you're living your life. And that just goes to show that there has been a lot of change in a way that I think sometimes people don't want to acknowledge. People have become so cynical in the last 9 months, rightfully so. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be cynical about the way that things are in the United States, but it's good to remind ourselves that depending on where you are, things are maybe not so dire in terms of the narrative power that surrounds your environment. You start your book, the first chapter of the anthology, on the War on Terror. And it feels like it's the perfect question in the wake of Dick Cheney's passing. He's, of course, one of the main architects of the forever wars. How does the War on Terror narrative work to legitimize state violence, both outside of the U.S., but also inside the U.S.?
It's important to think about who becomes the protagonist in these stories. And so after 9/11, the media, the right-wing establishment, the conservatives, even the centrist Democrats created a boogeyman out of Muslim people. And we saw that here in New York exponentially with the surveillance of people going to mosque, living in their neighborhoods, the increased policing of Muslim communities and other brown communities. But we also saw the increase in infrastructure of the carceral state. So there's something called the Joint Terrorism Task Force that was created, which basically expands the surveillance state of every single police jurisdiction in the United States by adding federal officers to those jurisdictions. And so the War on Terror created a boogeyman. It created an expansion of the carceral state and an increase in policing and surveillance. And it also justified discrimination against Muslim people and also instigated, as you said, these forever wars abroad, which decimated places like Afghanistan and Iraq and invested billions and billions of taxpayer dollars into wars that the American people did not want. And as you'll read in Liberation Stories from Dr. Maha Halal and Curry Peterson Smith, they really trace the narrative architecture of the War on Terror and identify the way that the social movement left combated it. And just to bring these two elements into conversation with each other, the Joint Terrorism Task Force were used to suppress protest of the Black Lives Matter movement. So that architecture, that infrastructure of the carceral state and the carceral logic used to defend it and to fund it was used against other movements, including Occupy and Black Lives Matter. And so we have to ask ourselves, when the U.S. faces a crisis, how does the Justice Department, how does the state apparatus and oppositional forces use that crisis to create a more rigid, controlled society that really doesn't benefit anybody, instead of dealing with the root problems of the crises that we face here?
Yeah, I mean, I think addressing the root problems, as a concept, sounds almost easy, but I think there are so many people who disagree on A, what the root problem is, and B, on how to solve the problem. And I think that's really what we're seeing right now. But to return to the topic of narrative power and narrative organizing, of course, the goal of narrative organizing is to dismantle the oppressive narratives that we live with. And in your words, I'm going to quote you now, quote, challenging and rewriting the stories that devalue lives and justify oppression, end quote. So we are having this conversation right after Zohran Mamdani's decisive win for mayor in New York City. And so I was thinking we could talk a little bit about his messaging and his campaign as a small case study. It's like very hot off the trail, so, there's only so much we can analyze in this moment. But we can talk about his messaging and his campaign as a case study for successful narrative organizing. It's clear, right, that despite the constant fear-mongering about him being an immigrant, being Muslim, and a democratic socialist, he prevailed. So in your mind, what are the elements of the narrative power framework that he used to get his messaging across?
Yeah, this is such a good question. So in the introduction to the book, we offer a narrative power framework because frameworks tell social movement workers where to start, how their work is advancing and progressing, gives us a baseline to assess our efforts against. And without them, we can kind of second guess ourselves or be confused about how to be aligned with our coalition allies. And, there's an analysis element of that. And what we want to do is understand what stories are being told that determine what people think and how they feel and how they might vote and how they understand the social issues of our time. And that analysis element is really important because I was listening to your episode with Stephanie Luce, and she was talking about the importance of understanding power, that you don't just go out with a strategy without doing a power analysis. And the same is true for the narrative realm. What Zohran understood and what his base certainly wanted was for him to not have exclusionary politics. A candidate who doesn't say, I'm going to govern for everybody except for X, Y, and Z population, which is what we saw with the other candidates and what we've seen with the Democratic establishment for decades, really since Obama. But Zoran understood that his base was interested in a broad multiracial coalition where you didn't exclude some people over others. And he also had a set of principles that he was undergirded by. So these are guardrails for how you communicate about people, places, ideas, and things in inhumane and dignified ways. And Mamdani was uncompromising in his principles. And I felt so proud to see this young Muslim New Yorker who was interested in talking about Palestine, interested in being uncompromising about how he talked about the economic issues of our time and focused on working class people. So that was incredibly important. And from a tactical perspective, as a communications director for many years, I understand the importance of message discipline. He was dogged about talking about freezing the rent, free childcare, free buses, faster buses, and just meeting the needs of people in addition to talking about, of course, the important identity-based issues that we cannot relegate to the side because a person's class, for example, is deeply intertwined with their identity. Those things are not mutually exclusive. So how a person exists in the world is connected to where they come from and what languages they speak and what they earn. And all of those are relevant. And so tactically, I thought that was really important. And I think the other things that were important is that he was connected to the organizing infrastructure of New York City. They knocked over 3 million doors. He was at the nightclubs. He was doing Tai Chi. He was visiting with people of all different ages and races and ethnic backgrounds in all of the important enclaves of New York City. I mean, there's so many things he did narratively that were important. A simple, clear message that people could get behind. An uncompromising commitment to an inclusive and intersectional base of people. A willingness to go to the doors and communicate with people and not just do it through social media. To be asked the hard questions and answer them. And in some instances, have to walk back some of his earlier assertions, for example, about defunding the police.
Yeah.
And admittedly, for those of us who are abolitionist and who believe in a new way of doing public safety, it can feel disappointing. But as a strategist, we understood that he also had a campaign to win. And we are so excited that he did.
Yeah, it's very exciting that he did. One of the sections in your book that I thought was really interesting was on political platforms. And we forget that political platforms are the classic way for politicians to tell the story of their campaign. And that, of course, they hope will persuade voters. And it's clear that Mamdani really used his policy agenda as a narrative tool. For me personally, the most exciting thing as a mother is that he was for universal childcare. I really think that this, if he can pull it off, is going to be transformative for people's lives, for the economy. I think the fact that so many women are prevented from working because it's so expensive to get childcare, we would unlock so much human potential, even if they're not making big gobs of money. But this work for me, for example, is so rewarding. And I think it makes for a better society when you make this equitable way of being possible.
Yeah.
But I have a question about defunding the police, because there's a whole section about this also in the book. And since you just mentioned that you had to walk this back, tell us a little bit about how you explained how defunding the police is a foil, in some sense, to get change that's necessary.
Yeah, this isn't unique to this iteration of the social movement left. We have been using flanks and foils as a part of our strategy for over a century. So, I'm the former director of communications for the Movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter Global Network. And those coalitions have worked very hard to expand the frame on how people understand public safety in America. And that has translated to transnational organizing as well. And in 2020, we saw the largest protest against racial injustice that we have ever in U.S. history, with 26 million Americans going to the streets. And while those numbers are very impressive, to me, what was even more impressive was the rigor of the Black Lives Matter movement organizers and the Movement for Black Lives. And I just want to say, for people who are listening who don't understand the two things and how they're different, most movements have coalitions, and the Movement for Black Lives is the broad coalition that welcomed all of the organizations who were politicized and radicalized to fight for Black lives after the death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, and after the death of Michael Brown. And the Black Lives Matter Global Network was one organization inside of that coalition, and there were 100 or more others. It's that the Black Lives Matter Global Network had the moniker of the movement, which was given to us by the media. That wasn't something that we chose. We chose to call ourselves the Movement for Black Lives, and that was an intentional decision point. And those things get lost to history, but
thanks for explaining that.
Yeah, as the former comms director, it is my kind of narrative assignment to ensure that people understand the distinction between these groups. However, to your question about defund the police, what people often don't know or understand is the evolution of that slogan and why it came about. Certainly we had used divest, invest language for decades. It doesn't have the same kind of salience or even ability to cause a frustration in the listener or an excitement or a curiosity. And that really is the importance and function of slogans and social movements or even, broader efforts to inspire people through emotion to feel something or to say something or to do something different. And Black Visions, which was previously Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, decided that they needed an incendiary derivative of the divest, invest language that we have been using. And divest, invest is used across movement disciplines. It's really about divesting from harmful systems and investing in systems that benefit, the majority of people rather than just a select few. Well, defund the police was the phrase that they chose. And the demand really was this kind of incendiary way of getting people to react to the moment. And it did. We had the incoming president and the former president all opining about the slogan critically. In the book, Dorian Warren and Catherine Allenberger offer a framework for how to understand if you're actually building narrative power. So it's got 4 elements. You have got to first put an issue on the agenda. And that is what we did. There was the kind of natural momentum of everyday people who were so upset about what they saw happen to George Floyd and wanted to take action. Mind you, we're in the middle of COVID. So at the same time, people are looking for ways to be involved in their community. And this was a way. And so the issue was on the agenda. And then what Dorian and Catherine say you have to do next is make that issue salient to people. So how do you make an idea like defunding the police less abstract and more concrete for people? You give them examples of what it looks like. And that's precisely what we did. We created messaging documents. We did spokespersons trainings. We helped people describe what it would be like to create a new infrastructure for public safety, not just to tell them we need to do it, but to show them how it's possible and give them examples like Cahoots in Oregon that was allowing for trained professionals in de-escalation to ride along with police or to replace even those people who answer those calls for a mental health crisis. The third thing that they say is that you need to be persistent. You need to keep it on the agenda over time. Now, this is something we talked about for 3 years. You may not remember now because it's 2025, but from 2020 to 2023, we talked about defunding the police, and that's in part because of the reaction from the right. Conservative candidates spent $33 million on attack ads relative to defunding the police in the 2022 midterms. This told us that this was still a persistent and salient conversation. And then the final thing that Dorian and Catherine tell us to do is, and that's the hardest thing, I think, and you might agree with me, Mila, is to change people's worldviews. How do you actually get people to think differently about these things? And I'll just give you one example. In 2021, when those children and teachers in Uvalde, Texas were gunned down, I watched online as everyday people started to ask questions about the scope, budget, and role of policing because the police were outside the building. So the question becomes, how do you stop violence before it happens rather than having the police show up after it happens? And what kind of infrastructure do we need to build in order to make that happen?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest frustrations with all the police outside is that it was clear that taxpayers are paying for the police, and then they didn't actually do anything, or not for a long time anyway. We'll be back with Shanelle in just a moment, so stay with us. You wouldn't want to miss this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, starting something new is tough. When I first started Future Hindsight, I had to figure out all the facets of podcasting on my own, which meant that every single day introduced a new question that needed a new answer, and fast. That can be an overwhelming feeling when your to-do list just grows and grows with new tasks every day. Honestly, that list can pretty easily take over your life if you're not careful. So, how can you find the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything? Because that can be such a game changer. For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, from household names like Gymshark and Alo Yoga to fresh brands that are just getting started. So if you want to get started, take the first step with your own design studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand style. And maybe you want to accelerate your content creation. Great! Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. With so many great tools at your fingertips, you can get the word out as if you have an entire marketing team behind you. In just a few quick minutes, you can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. So, if you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. What I love about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. Shopify.com/hopeful. Cha-ching! We also want to share about a podcast we know you'll enjoy. Take a listen.
Malcolm Gladwell here. This season on Revisionist History, we're going back to the spring of 1988 to a town in northwest Alabama where a man committed a crime that would spiral out of control.
There was this joke that said that it was easier to get forgiveness in the Church of Christ for murdering somebody than it was to be divorced.
From Revisionist History, this is The Alabama Murders. Listen to Revisionist History, The Alabama Murders, wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Shanelle Matthews. So you said something interesting just now about the larger picture and how you change your mind, how you basically take on a different worldview. And, we just talked about the Mamdani campaign. And in my mind, what was so effective was his unrelenting focus on affordability. That's pretty narrow, though. Like, how do you go from talking about affordability, which is like a strategy of a political campaign, to the bigger ideological battle, winning the hearts and minds? How do we jump from discussing the political platform to talking about the big ideas like justice, democracy, freedom, liberty?
This is a question that movement workers have been trying to grapple with for many decades. I want to point to the 1960s and 70s when the Black Panther Party evolved as a group with the desire to do something different than the civil rights movement, right? Which is to be unapologetically Black and not really hold up the mantle of anti-violence, rather of self-defense. They were interested in advancing a Black power politic, but they weren't willing to do that at the expense of people's material needs being met. And so what did they do? They created a free breakfast program. They did a Black Panther school. Right here in New York, in Harlem, Mutulu Shakur created an acupuncture project that provided health and wellness to Black people who were not able to access that kind of support from the city or from private health insurance. And so the question of meeting people's basic needs in order to help politicize them on the social issues is one that is alive, and we are constantly grappling with that. The organizations I'm a part of are very reflective in this moment where the left has in many ways lost some of our advancements of the 2010s. And by lost, I mean they were taken away, stripped away, repoed, if you will, by right-wing actors who are advancing a fascist agenda. But Mamdani was right that we do have to talk about how much it costs to get around, whether or not you can afford to live in the city that you're from, that you work in, that you contribute to, how much it costs for childcare. As you said earlier, it's incredibly expensive. And I'm not a parent, but my friends who are parents are telling me that's upwards of $2,000 a month to pay for kids, and that some people just can't even go to work because they can't make that much. So it's better for them to stay home. But then what happens to their dreams and vision of their life? And so we do have to talk about how to make sure that people have what they need to survive. In many ways, alongside and sometimes before we ask them to get involved in fights that feel a little bit more abstract to them. One example of this is the fight around DEI for advancing the rights of trans people and Black people and ensuring that there's equality across access to education and wages. But it's been weaponized, of course, by oppositional forces in ways that make it not legible to everyday people what we're really talking about. You know, the task of the social movement left as well is to clarify what this fight is actually about. But how could we get people who are on the periphery of the fight for advancing some of these rights involved? We first need to speak to what it is that they're worried about. And I think that this is an opportunity for the left to do this over the next many decades, to really earn back the working class loyalties that we had fought so hard for in the 20th century.
You mentioned that the left needs to earn back the trust on the messaging and really, I think, believing the things that are being said. I think that's really hard. I think that was one of the failures of the 24 campaign, that people didn't believe that the vice presidential campaign was really meaning what she said. And at the same time, you already also mentioned that, of course, the right is very busy in rolling back a lot of the gains. So there is backlash against DEI. There is the larger picture of us being in this reactionary time. You know, if you think of history being cyclical, then we are definitely very firmly in the time of reactionary politics. And actually, I have to add here also that the right spends billions of dollars in a way that I feel like the left doesn't. And I think there's a sense on the left that that's like dirty politics, so they won't do it. But I'm like, no, but those guys are on message all the time, and they know what the message is, and they repeat it from morning to night, and then tomorrow they know what the next message is, and they repeat it from morning to night, and there's not this kind of discipline, but also not this kind of spending writ large on the left. So if you could have unlimited resources, what do you think is like the most salient message? What's the most salient narrative for this time to get us out of this moment that can really unite people?
In the anthology, we talk a lot about traditions, movement traditions, because in the mega nonprofit organizations that I've worked at in the past, I found that the connection to the history of social movements was missing. That it's almost as if social movements started when the nonprofit industrial complex started. And that simply isn't true. People have always fought for their ability to be self-determined in the U.S. and everywhere. And one thing I know to be true as a student of social movements and a student of history is that there is no one right narrative. There are wrong narratives. There are narratives that frustrate an already kind of flustered faction of people who are trying to make change and people who are struggling to make ends meet. But what I would say is that what we're experiencing is often called unprecedented, but there are examples of the past of similar situations. And so you mentioned we're in a reactionary political era. And that is true. And it's not the first time that we've been here. Reactionary politics is characterized by a nostalgia for the past, a selective populism, a, usage and functioning of a propaganda apparatus that coerces people to vote and act against their best interest and in the interest of the capitalist class and the ruling class. And so we can think about one example as post-Reconstruction. This is a time where we saw Black political power increasing. Black people were becoming business owners and building their own communities and raising their own families. And for the first time in American history, they were able to be self-determined and living out their lives. And this was a threat to the status quo. At the time, there were a lot of physical manifestations of anti-Black racism that were rejecting this increased Black power and this multiracial democracy. But there were also stories being told. And one of those stories that was told was about redemption. Redemption was a post-Reconstructionist Confederate narrative that is basically make America great again in another hat. As some people might say, history repeats itself, but it's not repeating itself, but it is using a similar playbook because some of those deep narratives about anti-Blackness and fear of the other and American supremacy and exceptionalism are very deeply rooted in our society. So right now, advancing a multiracial democracy that is inclusive of the interest of everybody who lives in this country is something that we can do. And we're seeing right now that the message has to be clear. It has to be speak to people's material conditions. We can't talk in this highfalutin abstract, jargon-filled language that the left has been using for the last many decades, which is, I'm part of that problem too. And I think there's a lot of reasons why we did that. But, we're in a time now where we have to contest for ideological power for the hearts and minds of everyday people. And that means understanding what they believe, where they get their information, what assumptions they're making, and what values they hold close so that we can articulate that vision of society in a way that they can hear it.
Well, you just mentioned self-determination. And one of my big frustrations is that a lot of us in the year 2025 think of ourselves as consumers, maybe recipients of, quote, entitlement. And I think there's like a huge misunderstanding about how these programs work because the way that this is worded, entitlements, it's not obvious to the everyday person that actually taxpayers have already paid into Social Security and have already funded SNAP dollars. And my question here is how can we go from this framework of not thinking of ourselves as citizens, to think of ourselves as protagonists in our future, as political agents, as Stephanie Luce would say. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guests to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights you've shared with us into action and be these protagonists of our future?
When we think about narrative power, what we're contesting against is something called cultural hegemony, which is how the dominant beliefs of the most dominant groups in our society become normalized. And that's a fancy way of saying that powerful people get to tell their stories and people without a lot of power are often silenced. So I would say one spark is for people to tell their stories of their experiences in their communities. That could be becoming an organizer, which I think is the way that change has to happen, is to be organized in our communities and unified against the people who would silence us, and to build power by knocking on doors and making calls and being in community with one another. But, to also get involved in your local government, to go to hearings if you can, or city council meetings, and to tell your story about what matters to you, what your family needs to be able to thrive, what you want your dollars to be invested in. Because in that vacuum, if we don't tell those stories, if we don't talk about our multiracial, multi-ethnic, working class communities as the center of our society in America, that vacuum will be filled by the most powerful people, and they will make policy decisions that impact our lives in devastating ways, as we've seen with climate change and wage theft and, as you mentioned, a lack of access to childcare, for example. So get involved in your local community, talk about the importance of what matters to your family, and don't be afraid to tell your story.
So you're also a teacher. You teach at City College. Tell us a little bit about your experience there, what you're teaching, and what the response is from your students.
I love this question because I never anticipated that I would be a teacher. I became a movement worker 15 years ago, and I was invited to do an interview for a book on Black Lives Matter and the democratic necessity of social movements by a professor of politics, Diva Woodley, who's now at Brown, but who used to be at the New School. And she saw something in me I just didn't see in myself and invited me to teach a semester at the New School, and that turned into 10 semesters, and now I'm a full-time distinguished lecturer at City College. What I love about being at City College is that this is a population of working class multiracial students who are genuinely the future of New York, the future of American democracy. And they are very curious about the role of social movements in democracy building. And I think it's important to say I'm not a trained academic. I come into the classroom as a practitioner of movement praxis. And so they get to see what it's like to build power on the front lines of social change, in addition to getting the theory that they get from the rest of their professors. They want to know, what are the roles that I could play in a social movement? What are my options for making my community better? How do I connect my personal story to larger systemic issues, right? This is what narrative organizing is. And so some of them are actively doing that. I had a student last semester who was working with street vendors. She's Chinese and was a translator for street vendors and organizers to ensure that their rights were not being trampled on by the police or by local businesses. And she found so much insight in the lessons in liberation stories, but also in having conversations with other students who are also doing organizing work. But there were students who were not interested in necessarily going into social movements, but they wanted to know, look, I would want to be a nurse or I want to be a lawyer. How do I bring my values into these occupations? And so just big shout out to all of the practitioners practitioner teachers who are bringing the lessons of social movements and frontline organizing into the classroom, whether that's, middle school, high school, community college, someplace like City College or other universities. Because at a time when books are being banned, when teachers are being suppressed, they're being fired for articulating ideas, when there is an attack on being awakened to new ideas, teachers like that really do maintain and help to ensure that the democracy that we all aspire to is realized at some point.
Well, I'm so happy that there's kind of like a resurgence of teaching civic engagement on a formal level, but also that there's this interest overall. I think it's difficult to see right now because we are in the middle of the second Trump administration. But I do think that the first Trump administration really changed the way people think about politics. And even though it has been uneven in terms of the results, the fact that the United States is not in a place where it is more inclusive, but I think this is the muddling through. This is the process of finding the way forward. And there are multiple forces trying to basically reshape the narrative going forward. I think that work is ongoing in a really intense way from the right and the left, and also from the center. I mean, if you look at the fact that Senator Schumer never endorsed Mamdani, I think there is a, quote, center. I don't know whether I would call it center, but I think people would understand that as a center, as being a place that also wants to keep holding on to the narrative, even though I think that ship has sailed.
Yeah, I would agree. The Democratic establishment, as we've known it, is grasping for air at this point and, has been in many ways unimaginative and unable to maintain the energy of an increasingly growing faction of Gen Z and Gen Alpha and younger millennial people who are interested in a new way of doing politics. And I think it's important to mention that social movements play a really important role in our political life. The social movement left has a hard assignment to both organize alongside radical Democratic politicians like Cori Bush, like Zohran Mamdani, like Rashida Tlaib, these people who are oftentimes you're voting for them on the Working Families party line, which is an important element of our narrative infrastructure, as well as having these alternative parties to be able to advance. But social movements have to distance themselves from the Democratic Party and really separate ourselves out as change makers, as people who refuse to be okay with the status quo, and as folks who expand what people imagine is politically, socially, and economically possible. That is our job, and that is precisely what we saw happen last night in New York. The possibility of a new Democratic Party establishment, the possibility of organizing combined with Democratic politics. That is the future of American politics, and I am so glad to be a part of it in some small way.
Yeah. You've been in this space for a long time, being a radical communicator. Tell us about what makes you hopeful looking into the future, because it feels, even though we had these victories this week across the board, even Supreme Court justice seats in Pennsylvania that I think were really up for grabs and people weren't sure, but people turned out. So looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I'm able to stay hopeful by remembering the past, actually. And this goes back to the conversation you and I were having about reactionary versus progressive politics, is that there is no utopia. I'm reminded by this when I read Robin D.G. Kelley says, we struggle for the sake of more struggle. And that is a philosophy that keeps me hopeful, is that I get to wake up and continue to struggle for the self-determination of the people that I love and care about. And that just like the win here in New York in the mayoral election, there will always be those beacons of hope that tell us that a different future, a future where everybody can have access to what they need to thrive, where the multiracial working class of our societies is able to feed their families and care for themselves, that is possible. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful because we've seen it before. And I remain committed to also the narrative organizing that is required to build that future.
Mm-hmm. Hear, hear. I'm reminded of Bernard Harcourt, who was on the show at the very beginning, our very, very first episode, and he said that the pursuit of justice is a journey. It's not a destination. Mm-hmm. And it's something that we just have to keep doing all the time, forever and ever. And it's okay. We can embrace that. Thank you so much, Shanelle, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Mila.
Shanelle Matthews is the co-editor of Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements, and the founder of the Radical Communicators Network. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Tell your story. Share your experiences. It's one of the first and maybe one of the most powerful steps in organizing, and it might just be the engine that gets you involved in local politics. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be sharing an episode from a fantastic podcast called Shifting Terrain. Make sure you listen. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We are here to build your civic action toolkit every week. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, consider subscribing to the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,